So, I have a great honor of talking about PPMD in the past for just a second, because I know what's important to us right now is where we are and where we're going. But sometimes it helps us to celebrate a journey and to celebrate where we've been and where we've come from so we can understand the great momentum that we have right now. So, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 3 words when spoken for the first time: after, it can change a life as you know it. In 1984, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy founder and president Pat Furlong heard those words, and with these words, a Duchenne diagnosis for both of her young sons, a tiny seed was planted and a revolution was started. Pat sought others who too were hearing this diagnosis. A small group of parents and grandparents, all determined to make a difference, gathered, and there were many questions among them. What would you do if this was your son? What is the investment in Duchenne research? What is the standard of care? Unfortunately, these easy questions were hard to answer. And even though our Duchenne families were everywhere, we learned that the investment in Duchenne research was not equitable to that of other diseases of similar incidence and prevalence. We also learned that there was no standard of care, no consensus on how to treat our sons and some daughters. With that, Pat and others set out to seek some answers and had some basic thoughts. Why was there little to no federal investment in Duchenne research? Who are the leaders in the field? How do we get to know them and work with them? During those beginning years, PPMD grew to understand that one idea, one approach, and one investment was not going to move the needle in Duchenne. So to create change, PPMD needed to invest in research feeding basic science, initial drug discovery, and other novel approaches. Invest in people and pathways, researchers and leaders in the field who understood the pathology, who had the vision and the determination to stay in Duchenne for the long haul. Partner with leaders in the field. This included scientists, physicians, physical therapists, caregivers, and other like-minded parents and parent organizations. Innovate. What still needs to be done? What hurdles lie ahead? By creating and opening pathways to those living with Duchenne, we open access and opportunities. So, PPMD was born with one priority, one goal, one mission: end Duchenne. PPMD's leadership knew that convening the experts was key. Bring the community together and unite them in our fight. So, in 1994, PPMD held its first annual conference right here in Orlando, Florida. With 35 people gathered together, our work had begun. PPMD began seeking out those researchers in the field: Dr. Lee Sweeney, Dr. Eric Hoffman, Dr. Jerry Mendel, Dr. Kevin Flanagan, Lou Kunkel were among some of the early pioneers, names that we still placed our trust in today. PPMD families also began aggressively fundraising and were soon able to announce the first ever Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy Research Center in 1997, as well as funding to researchers across the country. Our work to fund every promising research pathway was underway. By 2000, PPMD organized advocacy efforts and made our voices heard in Washington, D.C. Never before had Duchenne been so prominent in the minds of lawmakers. Never was a community so determined to keep the pressure on to pass that first Duchenne legislation, the MD Care Act. Even in a country forced into turmoil by 9/11, that was passed. Together, the Duchenne community joined forces, working together to create awareness, momentum, and change. PPMD's unique ability to convene the experts, the community partners, families, and friends helped to create a movement that rippled through the entire disease space. Innovate. PPMD's focus to make research better and faster, to open pathways and navigate hurdles has always been at the heart of what we do. By establishing the Certified Duchenne Care Centers, PPMD addressed the need to provide optimal care. This network continues to grow and expand. And as drugs have come to market, PPMD has been there, representing the patient voice, leading the efforts to draft guidance for the FDA, leading the change for an ICD-10 code, and beginning to navigate the access and payer environment. We have seen so much happen over the 25 years, the driving force being the determination and passion and commitment and conviction of this community. Today, we look back at 25 years proudly, and we look forward to the hope, the optimism, and we see the momentum like we have never seen before. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us today. And from this moment forward, we're talking about this moment and forward. Thank you.
So first of all, welcome again. I guess you'll hear welcome 1,000 times, and maybe you're saying, I wish I was on vacation somewhere else. But we're really happy that you're here. If we think about those questions way back then, where are the standards of care? Where's the investment? What would you do if this was my son or your son? Those questions are still remaining, right? We still have evolved those questions, and now they're a little more complicated. So if we think about who are we as a community, we're a pretty big community. We're not only a US community, we're a worldwide community. We have contacts around the globe because the real idea here is that every person diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy needs access to optimal care and therapies, and those therapies need to be reimbursed so that no family goes bankrupt trying to achieve their dreams for their children. So it is our job to have this collective voice raised worldwide. And when we think about who we are, and we still think about the diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, I'm always a little bit puzzled when some family calls and said, I just got a diagnosis of my son. He has mild or moderate or severe Duchenne, or maybe mild or moderate or severe Becker. And I think, wow, that's hard, because what does it mean? So maybe in the future, we'll see a diagnosis that isn't Duchenne or Becker or mild or moderate or severe, but a dystrophinopathy diagnosis. And we just had a pre-conference to look at females, girls, who have muscle weakness before the age of puberty. And we also know there are moms who are carriers of this disease, and it was very interesting to hear one of the young women say, but what am I carrying? So maybe it isn't about a carrier, maybe it's about a female with a dystrophinopathy, and maybe dystrophinopathy is where we need to go. Because I'd be hopeful that as our companies develop trials and as our investigators develop trials, then the inclusion criteria could be dystrophinopathy. And so it wouldn't be just an ambulatory status that can get off the floor in 8 seconds, but it would be people with dystrophinopathy and weakness, associated weakness, so that we can get safety data across so that people aren't left off the bus waiting for an approval and then navigating a system that may well say no to them at the end of the day. So if we could think about the diagnosis as a dystrophinopathy at some point in the future, perhaps we'd be more inclusive and more understanding of the females who exhibit weakness or cardiac disease and the males who are also on this full spectrum. And so the Becker patients wouldn't feel like they're waiting for something that they may never access. So I just throw that out there as a possibility for the future. And the standards of care were published in 2018 and before that 2010. And the standards of care are always sort of a consensus statement. And I think our community is really being used to kicking those borders out. So we have to take that standard of care and first of all implement it across the world and make sure that everyone has access, but also that the data is collected so that we can better predict the disease progression here, so that we can better look at an individual with this diagnosis and understand a bit more about their condition instead of a mild, moderate, severe, and maybe I don't know, so that we can better predict and so that we can understand what drugs are doing, both safety and benefit, and so that we can predict the right drug for the right person at the right time so that their outcomes are as best as we can deliver at the time, with the idea of always going further. And research, I'd like to say that we don't have to invest in basic research because we know it all. We don't. I wish we did, but we don't. We have to learn about what are the differences of a child with the same mutation as another child, and what are the differences if one progresses more rapidly or less rapidly. So we have to learn about genetic modifiers, and there are people in the audience here, Kevin Flanagan and others, who are looking at trying to understand what makes a difference in progression. So the investment in basic science to understand this disease is really important, and it isn't over yet. So we still don't understand all of the nuances of this disease. So the investment in basic science is important. The investment in data collection is critical so that we can develop trials that are more sensitive and hopefully less time consuming for all of us. We really need to do some work here, maybe a protein signature. I think it's really important to understand how much data really controls and helps us understand better this disease. So better data collection. We have a registry and we collect patient-reported outcomes data. Participating in that registry is really, really important because we're soon evolving that to hopefully integrate the hospital records, the EHRs, with our PRO so that we really get a full picture of this young man or this woman that has this diagnosis. So data. Where's the data? And that should be a question on all of our minds when we're thinking about care, when we're thinking about joining a trial. Where's the data? What do we know to date? What are the questions I need to ask? And what are the considerations for me to join this particular study? Partnering with companies. 25 years ago, there wasn't a company in that room. There were 35 people, and we were all staring at each other, kind of saying, what do you think we could do together? Well, it turns out a lot. And so now we have 46 companies that are looking at Duchenne muscular dystrophy with the possibility of delivering a therapy, an approved therapy. We have 21 active clinical trials, and we have 20 companies here in the room today. That's pretty spectacular. And it runs everything from gene therapies to exon skipping to express that protein and all the downstream, the fibrosis, the inflammation, all of that, and then looking at the heart as well. Because we have to think about this. The heart's a muscle too, right? And if you extend ambulation for years and years and years, and these young men grow up to be old guys taking care of their old aging parents, which would be terrific, is that heart built to last? And if it isn't, how are we going to protect it? How are we going to fix it? How are we going to make sure that heart is healthy enough to sustain that adult throughout a lifetime? So there's lots to do here. And so the companies here are also designing clinical trials. And clinical trials, for those of you who've participated, are not simple. So the first few weeks, I'm sure, are exciting, and by the time you get to the 4-month mark and the 6-month mark, it's really hard. And it's hard on our sons, and it's hard on our families and our extended families. So what can we do collectively to reduce the burden of those clinical trials? How can we speak to companies to help them understand what's meaningful to us in terms of reducing that burden? And those are things that this collective voice can do. They can influence trials. They can talk about the number of biopsies. We can all talk about the use of placebo. I think that's one of those things that hangs heavy on our shoulders as parents, because having a placebo, an exposure to placebo for a year, even 6 months, when you know the trajectory of this disease, feels like too much time to give to something that is not going to be useful by definition. So how can we work together and think that? And that gets back to data, and that gets back to understanding natural history. That gets back to understanding the critical path initiative and the CTAP initiative and how they're looking at data and looking at those biostatisticians who, I'm not sure how their brain works, but they are able to take a look mathematically and be able to predict. And maybe, just maybe, we can get away from placebos, which would be ideal for our children and for ourselves. So I think we have lots to work on. And then clinical trials. You know, I think of these clinical trials which are extraordinary to put on. These multi-site extraordinary clinical trials, you know, the companies talk about 20 sites, and they're getting them up, and they have to contract those sites. They have to go through the institutional review board, so their IRB approval. They have to do all these things, and sometimes it takes a couple months to get a trial up and running, sometimes a year or more to get a trial up and running. That's crazy when we're all waiting, right? So it takes a lot to get them up, and then to execute on those trials, and then to analyze the data, and then to go back to the FDA or the regulatory EMA, someone to decide if this drug is both safe and useful, and then to get an approval. So can we think about doing trials differently? Could we imagine a day when there's every child and every individual diagnosed with Duchenne is in a clinical trial, no matter the age, no matter the degree of function, and we're trying to drive and understand whether that drug works as quickly as possible so we get to, for this individual, a no, yes or no decision, and then we can wash them out and get them in another trial. And the whole goal of that would be to combination therapies. 25 years ago, I sat with 35 people, and we all shook our head, combination therapies. We have to get there. We still have to get there. So if we could do trials differently, if we could think through how to do some of these trials differently, that they were more inclusive, that we could get to faster answers, I think that would be terrific. And then maybe we could really shake our heads and be thankful for combination therapies. It's an exciting time in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It must make all of you thrilled to see all the companies. I feel incredibly blessed that PPMD has been instrumental in funding research and in helping with trials and gathering a community and being a convener and bringing all of us together in different circumstances. We'll continue to do that with meetings, with advocacy, with looking at very specific issues in care. And it's really a hopeful time, but we're still watching and waiting because there are kids who don't fit in trials. They're all waiting. And then we all thought, as soon as we get an approval, then it'll be easy, right? We'll just get that prescription, the doc will write this prescription, and the next day we get whatever it is that was approved for our child. Didn't exactly work that way. What we learned is that there's another hurdle, and that's called access and reimbursement. And that is working with payers to make them understand, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, right? When they don't really have that experience. And then to describe what's a clinically meaningful difference for our children. Because a payer might not understand that a boy who doesn't walk anymore can now lift his arms above his head. And that's amazing because that means he can scratch his head and hug his mom and hug his dad, hug his grandma, because I'm a grandma now, and he can feed himself. So that's beneficial, right? That's meaningful. So that intervention, protecting those functions would be incredible. So for a payer to say, no, you have to be walking, that's not a fair position and represents a lack of understanding of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we as a community have a lot of work to do, and that's why our collective voice matters. That's why your stories matter. That's why my story still matters. And everyone who's had an experience in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, that matters because I think we can change this world. And I would have said 25 years ago that this will be easy. That was pretty naive thinking. It was wishful thinking because in that time, I think it was Eric Hoffman who said, well, just get a virus, we'll stick in that gene and we'll just deliver it. And then we thought, that sounds easy. Turns out, it wasn't so easy. But we're here now, and the world has changed in every single area. In diagnosis, we'll soon launch newborn screening out of New York State. We want to reduce the age of diagnosis, make them younger so that we can treat them earlier. We want to be able to understand females who have dystrophinopathy so that we can make sure their lives are okay and good and they're protected. So once we launch that, the idea is then to screen a number of babies to be able to go and submit to the RUSP, which is the federal approval process to get this on the newborn screening list. So we have lots of work to do for diagnosis. We'll improve those standards of care, reduce the trial burden, get rid of the placebo. Companies in the audience are kind of shaking their head and saying no, but I think that it's an important issue to discuss and to try to push forward. Because after all, given the diagnosis and the trajectory, we have limited time to preserve and protect muscle function and make sure that heart operates. So that's our goal. Our single goal is to end Duchenne. So the questions are harder. They're more complicated. They haven't at all gone away. But we together have really changed this community and this world, and will continue to do so. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this team. It wasn't a world I wanted to join, ever. But now that I'm here, I'm grateful. I've met people that I would never have met. I've met amazing researchers and clinicians who care deeply, amazing families who make things happen that feel like magic to me, and a community of companies who feel that they can, too, make a difference. And we've also found a regulatory environment that felt like the FDA was behind this black box and they were secret people who didn't want to talk. They're listening to our voices and asking for our voices and calling us for advice. That wasn't here 25 years ago. So we're in a different place. Your stories matter, your voice matters. You can have a good life, even in the spite of a dystrophinopathy diagnosis. Remember, we're going to change that. So thank you for being here. Our first panel begins now. So thank you again.